The smell of betrayal has a particular scent, and on that October evening at Dorothy's 62nd birthday celebration, it wafted through her pristine dining room like poison. 20 family members had gathered around her mahogany table, and I stood there holding my dessert contribution, watching my mother-in-law lift the lid off what I assumed was someone else's casserole. She inhaled deeply, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the serving spoon, and then those words sliced through the warm family chatter like a blade through silk. "This smells familiar, Jillian," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as every conversation stopped. "Like the canned dog food my neighbor buys." The silence that followed was deafening. My husband Marcus nearly dropped his wine glass. His cousin David's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Even little Emma stopped chattering about her new school project. 20 pairs of eyes bounced between Dorothy and me like spectators at a tennis match, waiting to see how I would crumble under her latest assault. But something inside me had shifted. After 2 years of marriage and countless family gatherings where Dorothy had systematically chipped away at my confidence, I felt a strange calm settle over my shoulders. I set my chocolate tart down on the sideboard and turned to face her with a smile that probably looked more serene than I felt. "Thanks for the feedback, Dorothy," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But I didn't cook this." The color drained from her face faster than water from a broken dam. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and the serving spoon trembled in her grip. Frank, her husband, looked confused as he glanced between us, clearly trying to process what was happening. "What do you mean you didn't cook it?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed. "Whose dish is it?" I could have felt sorry for Dorothy in that moment, watching her carefully constructed facade begin to crack. But I remembered too many dinner parties where Shed made subtle comments about my cooking being interesting or experimental. Too many holiday gatherings where Shed suggested I might want to learn from watching instead of contributing to the meal. Too many times when Marcus had come home repeating his mother's gentle concerns about whether I was ready for the responsibility of feeding a family. "Well, Dorothy," I said, keeping my tone conversational, "since you seem to know exactly what it smells like, maybe you could tell us who made it." Her fingers gripped the spoon so tightly her knuckles went white. The room had grown so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off the seconds of her humiliation. Marcus was staring at his mother now, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he began to piece together the implications of what was happening. Dorothy had always prided herself on being the family matriarch, the keeper of traditions and standards. She wore her perfectionism like armor, never allowing a single detail of any gathering to be out of place. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her home spotless. She collected compliments on her hosting abilities like trophies, and she guarded her position as the family's culinary authority with fierce determination. But now, standing in her own dining room, surrounded by her own family, she had just compared someone's cooking to dog food without knowing whose it was. And from the look of growing horror on her face, I was beginning to suspect she knew exactly whose cooking she had just insulted. "I think," she stammered, "I think there might be something wrong with the recipe." "What recipe?" Beth, Marcus' sister, had just arrived and was pulling off her coat. "What's everyone talking about? The energy in here feels like someone died." Dorothy shot her daughter a look that could have frozen Lake Michigan in July, but Beth was oblivious to the tension as she hung her coat in the closet and joined the circle around the table. "Mom just compared this casserole to dog food," David explained, gesturing toward the offending dish. "But Jillian says she didn't make it." Beth's eyebrows shot up. "Oh no, Mom, you didn't." And in that moment, watching Dorothy's face cycle through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope, I knew exactly what had happened. The woman who had spent 2 years making me feel like an inadequate wife and daughter-in-law had just humiliated herself with her own cooking. Beth's reaction confirmed my suspicions, but Dorothy wasn't ready to surrender. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, channeling the imperious authority Shed wielded over family gatherings for decades. "There must be something wrong with the recipe Jillian gave you," she said to Beth, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she was determined to be right regardless of evidence. "She must have deliberately left out ingredients or changed measurements to sabotage me." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. I felt Marcus stiffen beside me, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to make sense of what his mother was suggesting. That his wife would deliberately sabotage his mother's cooking was exactly the kind of family drama Dorothy seemed to thrive on creating, But Beth was shaking her head vigorously, her brown curls bouncing with the motion. "Mom, what are you talking about? Jillian never gave me any recipe." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after Dorothy's initial insult. This was the heavy, suffocating silence that comes when a lie is exposed in front of witnesses. Frank set down his coffee cup with a clink that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. "Then where did you get the recipe?" Marcus asked his mother, and his voice carried a tone I'd never heard him use with her before. It was the voice of a man who was beginning to see his mother clearly for perhaps the first time. Dorothy's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her words came in a rush, as if she could somehow outrun the truth by talking fast enough. "I found it in one of Jillian's cookbooks when we were visiting last month. I thought it looked interesting, so I took a picture of it. I was going to surprise everyone by making it myself and showing how much I'd learned from Jillian's cooking style." Each word felt like a physical blow. Last month's visit had been for Marcus' birthday, and Dorothy had asked to see my kitchen, claiming she wanted to admire the renovations we'd done. I remembered her wandering around, commenting on my spice organization and asking about various appliances. What I hadn't realized was that she was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for her next attack on my credibility. But the violation went deeper than just stealing a recipe. The cookbook she was referring to wasn't just any cookbook. It was my grandmother's handwritten collection, filled with recipes passed down through generations, annotated with notes in my grandmother's careful script, stained with decades of love and use. It was the most precious thing I owned, the only tangible connection I had left to the woman who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. "You went through my grandmother's cookbook?" I asked, and I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. "You took pictures of her recipes without asking." Marcus turned to stare at his mother, and the look on his face was one I'd never seen before. It was disappointment and anger and something that might have been disgust, all rolled into an expression that made Dorothy take a step backward. "Mom, that cookbook is from Jillian's grandmother who passed away. Those are family recipes that belong to someone else's family. How could you just take pictures of them without permission?" Frank was looking at his wife like he was seeing a stranger. "Dorothy, what were you thinking?" But I was remembering more now, remembering the way Dorothy had lingered in my kitchen, the way Shed asked seemingly innocent questions about my cooking, the way Shed made comments about family traditions and the importance of preserving recipes for future generations. She hadn't been making conversation. She'd been planning this moment, this public humiliation where she would demonstrate her superiority by making my family's recipes better than I could. Except Shed failed spectacularly, and now everyone knew it. "I was trying to help," Dorothy said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I thought if I could learn Jillian's family recipes, I could help preserve them, and maybe even improve them, by stealing them and then calling them dog food when they didn't turn out the way you expected," Beth asked incredulously. The room was buzzing now with whispered conversations as family members began to understand what had actually happened. Dorothy had violated my privacy, stolen my family's culinary heritage, botched the execution, and then publicly humiliated the results without realizing she was criticizing her own cooking. But there was something else, something that made this betrayal cut even deeper than the theft and the insult. The recipe she had stolen wasn't just any family recipe. It was special in ways she couldn't possibly understand, connected to a story that I'd never shared with Marcus' family because it felt too precious, too fragile to expose to Dorothy's critical scrutiny. I could feel tears building behind my eyes, but they weren't tears of humiliation anymore. They were tears of grief and rage for the memory Dorothy had violated, for the trust she had broken, for the sacred space she had invaded without understanding what she was destroying. "That recipe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "belonged to my grandmother, Rose. But it wasn't originally hers." The room grew quiet again, sensing that we were approaching something important, something that would change the trajectory of this entire evening. Marcus reached for my hand, and I was grateful for his touch, for the anchor it provided as I prepared to share something I'd kept close to my heart for years. My grandmother worked as a line cook at Auguste Beaumont's restaurant in Chicago in the 1960s, before he became famous. She was one of his first students, and he taught her techniques that weren't written down anywhere else. "The recipe you stole was Auguste's original creation, handwritten by my grandmother with his personal notes and modifications." Frank's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down. Auguste Beaumont, the French chef? The one who won all those James Beard awards. I nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite my efforts to stay composed. He and my grandmother stayed in touch for years after she left the restaurant to raise my mother. That cookbook contains dozens of his early recipes, ones that were never published, never shared with the culinary world. My grandmother was saving them, hoping to honor his memory someday by opening a small restaurant that would feature his forgotten work. Marcus was staring at me with an expression of wonder and hurt. You never told me any of this, because your mother made it clear from the beginning that my cooking wasn't welcome in this family, I said, looking directly at Dorothy. Every time I brought something to a family gathering, you found ways to criticize it or suggest improvements. You made me feel like my grandmother's recipes weren't good enough for your table. Dorothy's face had gone ashen, and she was gripping the back of a dining chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The magnitude of what she had done was beginning to sink in, not just the theft and the insult, but the destruction of something irreplaceable and historically significant. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought it was just a family cookbook. You didn't ask, I replied. You saw something that belonged to me, something precious and personal, and you took it without permission. You violated my home, my privacy, and my trust. And then, you had the audacity to botch the recipe and call it dog food in front of everyone. The silence stretched out like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. I could see family members exchanging glances, finally understanding the pattern of behavior they'd witnessed over the years but never fully recognized. Dorothy's constant need to be the center of attention, her subtle undermining of anyone who might threaten her position as family matriarch, her way of making criticism sound like helpful concern. Marcus was holding my hand tighter now, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Jillian, I had no idea about any of this. Your grandmother, the recipes, what you've been going through with Mom. I didn't want to cause problems in your family, I said. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I was more patient, if I proved myself worthy, she would eventually accept me. By stealing your family's culinary heritage and humiliating you in public? Beth asked, her voice sharp with anger as she looked at her mother. Mom, this is beyond inappropriate. This is cruel. But even as the family began to turn against Dorothy, even as I watched her carefully constructed image crumble before my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of her betrayal. The look on her face wasn't just embarrassment or shame. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes their secrets are about to be exposed. And then the doorbell rang, cutting through the tension like a knife, and Frank went to answer it with obvious relief at the distraction. We could hear voices in the hallway, introductions being made, apologies for being late. That must be Jennifer and her new girlfriend, Beth said. I can't wait for you to meet Helena. She's a chef at one of those fancy downtown restaurants. As footsteps approached the dining room, I had no way of knowing that our evening of revelations was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Jennifer burst into the dining room with the kind of energy that could light up a small city, her cheeks flushed from the October cold and her smile wide with excitement. Behind her walked a woman I'd never seen before, tall and elegant with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Sorry we're late, everyone, Jennifer announced, unwinding her scarf. Traffic was insane downtown. This is Helena Morrison, the chef I've been telling you all about. Helena stepped forward with the confident grace of someone accustomed to professional kitchens, extending her hand to Frank with a warm smile. Thank you so much for including me in your celebration, Mr. Patterson. Jennifer speaks of her family constantly. As introductions were made around the room, I noticed Helena's nose twitch slightly, the way a sommelier might react to the scent of wine. Her gaze drifted toward Dorothy's casserole dish, and something shifted in her expression, a look of recognition that made my heart skip a beat. I'm so sorry, Helena said, interrupting her own introduction to Uncle Robert. But could I ask about that casserole? There's something about the aroma that seems incredibly familiar. Dorothy stiffened like a cat sensing danger. But before she could respond, David jumped in with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been dying to share gossip. Oh, you just missed the most dramatic thing ever, he said. Mom made this casserole and then compared it to dog food, but it turns out she stole the recipe from Gillian's grandmother's cookbook. Helena's eyebrows rose slowly, and she moved closer to the offending dish, inhaling carefully. When she looked up, her expression had changed completely, shifting from polite curiosity to something approaching awe. "May I ask," she said quietly, "what the name of this recipe is?" "I don't remember exactly," Dorothy mumbled, clearly hoping the conversation would move in another direction. But I remembered. I had memorized every recipe in my grandmother's cookbook, could recite the ingredients and instructions for any dish she'd written down. "It's called coq au vin Nouvelle Orleans style," I said. My grandmother noted that it was Auguste Beaumont's fusion of his French training with Louisiana influences he picked up from other cooks. The effect of my words on Helena was immediate and dramatic. She went completely still, her face cycling through a series of emotions I couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother was Rose?" Rose Sullivan, who worked at Augusta's first restaurant. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet was charged with anticipation rather than tension. I nodded, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fall or fly. Helena pressed her hand to her chest, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Oh my God, I've been looking for you for 5 years." Marcus squeezed my hand so tightly I thought he might break my fingers, but I barely noticed. The room seemed to spin around me as Helena continued talking, her words tumbling out in a rush of excitement and emotion. Auguste spoke about Rose constantly, right up until he passed away 5 years ago. She was his first real protégé. The student, he said, understood not just his techniques but his philosophy about food. He never got over losing touch with her after she left to raise her family. I could barely breathe. They lost touch. When she moved to suburban Chicago after she married, Auguste tried to keep in contact, but this was the 1970s, before email or social media. Letters got lost, phone numbers changed, but he never stopped talking about her. Never stopped crediting her with helping him develop some of his most innovative dishes. Helena turned to look directly at Dorothy's mangled casserole, and her expression grew sad. This was one of his signature dishes from the early days, before he refined it for his later restaurants. He always said Rose had suggested the Louisiana spice blend that made it special. The implications of what Helena was saying hit me like a physical force. My grandmother hadn't just worked for Auguste Beaumont. She had collaborated with him, contributed to his success, helped create the dishes that made him famous. And Dorothy had stolen that legacy, botched it beyond recognition, and then insulted it in front of his protégé. "There's more," Helena said, and she was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked at me. Auguste left specific instructions in his will. He wanted his personal effects, his early notebooks, his collection of original recipes to be returned to Rose or her family. He never forgot what she meant to him, how much she contributed to his success. The room was spinning now, and I had to sit down in the nearest chair to keep from falling over. 5 years ago, when Auguste Beaumont died, there had been articles in all the food magazines, tributes from famous chefs around the world. I had read every one, feeling a secret pride in my grandmother's connection to him, but never imagining that he had remembered her too. "I've been searching for Rose's family ever since," Helena continued. "Augusta's lawyers tried to track her down, but Rose Sullivan is a common name, and we didn't have much to go on. We knew Shed married and probably changed her name, that Shed had children, but the trail went cold." Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. And I realized that in the span of one evening, his understanding of his wife had been completely transformed. I wasn't just the woman his mother had been subtly bullying for 2 years. I was the granddaughter of a culinary legend, the keeper of recipes that could change culinary history, the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back to one of America's most celebrated chefs. And Dorothy, in her arrogance and her need to control everything around her, had nearly destroyed it. The revelation about my grandmother's connection to Auguste Beaumont seemed to break some kind of dam in the family's collective consciousness. As Helena continued to explain the significance of my grandmother's collaboration with the legendary chef, I watched family members begin to look at Dorothy with new eyes, seeing her behavior not as protective mothering but as destructive manipulation. Beth was the first to speak up, her voice shaking with a combination of anger and realization. "Mom, do you understand what you almost did? You could have destroyed something historically important." But Dorothy, cornered and desperate, doubled down on her justifications. "How was I supposed to know? It just looked like a regular recipe to me." If Jillian had bothered to explain the significance, I never would have touched it. You shouldn't have touched it anyway, Marcus said, and the steel in his voice made Dorothy flinch. You went through Gillian's personal belongings without permission. You stole family recipes. And then you had the nerve to criticize the results in public. Helena was still staring at me with wonder, but I could see other family members beginning to process the implications of what had happened. And slowly, like dominoes falling in sequence, they began to share their own experiences with Dorothy's manipulative behavior. Carol, Frank's sister who lived in Denver and only visited twice a year, cleared her throat hesitantly. I don't want to pile on, but since we're all being honest here, I have to say something that's been bothering me for months. All eyes turned to her, and she took a deep breath before continuing. Dorothy, at last year's family reunion, you told everyone that the garden design that won the Neighborhood Beautification Award was your idea, but I'm the one who designed it. I'm the landscape architect who spent weeks creating those plans and coordinating with the contractors. Frank's head snapped around to stare at his wife. What? Dorothy, you told me you'd designed that garden yourself. Carol nodded sadly. She asked me to help with some landscaping ideas, and I thought she just wanted advice. I created a complete design plan, plant lists, seasonal color schemes, everything. Then, at the reunion, she was showing pictures to everyone and talking about her natural talent for garden design and how proud she was of her creative vision. The pattern was becoming clear now, and I could see the recognition dawning on faces around the room. David, Marcus' cousin, rubbed his forehead and shook his head. Jesus, Dorothy, you did the same thing to me with Sarah, he said. Remember my girlfriend from college? The one I was crazy about? Marcus nodded. I remember her. Nice girl. What happened to her anyway? David's laugh was bitter. Your mother happened to her. Dorothy convinced me that Sarah's family was the wrong sort of people for our family. She told me Sarah was just using me to gain social status, that her parents were pushy social climbers who would never fit in with our family values. That's not true. Dorothy protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I know it's not true now, David continued. I ran into Sarah last year at a conference. She's a pediatric nurse, married to a high school teacher, raising 2 beautiful kids and volunteering at homeless shelters on weekends. Her parents are retired teachers who spend their time tutoring underprivileged kids. They're exactly the kind of people any family would be lucky to welcome. The room was completely silent as David's words sank in. Marcus was looking at his mother like he'd never seen her before, and I could practically watch him reviewing every conversation they'd ever had about me, every subtle criticism Dorothy had planted in his mind. Stephen, Marcus' older brother who ran a successful marketing firm, spoke up next. Dorothy, you did something similar to me too, didn't you? When I was looking to hire someone for that senior marketing position last year, Marcus turned to look at his brother, confusion evident on his face. What does that have to do with anything? I had offered Jillian an interview for the position, Stephen said quietly. Her resume was impressive, her portfolio was excellent, and I thought she'd be perfect for our team. But Mom called me and suggested that hiring Jillian might create family complications if things didn't work out. She hinted that Jillian might not be as competent as her resume suggested, that she had a tendency to overestimate her abilities, and that bringing family drama into my business would be unprofessional. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had applied for that position months ago, had been excited about the possibility of working with Marcus' brother, of finally having a chance to use my marketing degree and experience. When I never heard back, I assumed my qualifications weren't strong enough. You never told me you'd offered her an interview, Marcus said to Stephen, his voice dangerously quiet. Because Mom made it sound like it would be awkward for everyone involved, Stephen replied. She made it seem like she was protecting both Jillian and me from an uncomfortable situation. Marcus turned slowly to look at his mother, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was the look of a man who was realizing that someone he loved and trusted had been systematically poisoning his relationships and destroying opportunities for people he cared about. How many other times, Mom? He asked. How many other times have you interfered in people's lives, manipulated situations, spread lies or half-truths to maintain control? Dorothy opened her mouth to respond, but Frank held up his hand to stop her. Her husband, who had been growing progressively more horrified as each revelation came to light, looked older than I'd ever seen him. Don't, Frank said wearily. Don't make it worse by trying to justify this. I'm 65 years old, Dorothy, and I'm just now learning that my wife has been manipulating and controlling our family for years. I need time to process this. The birthday party that had begun with Dorothy's cruel insult was turning into something none of us had expected. A reckoning with years of accumulated damage, a moment when all of Dorothy's victims finally found their voices and spoke their truths. But I had the feeling we still hadn't reached the bottom of her deceptions. The weight of revelations was crushing, but Dorothy wasn't finished yet. As her carefully constructed image continued to crumble, she grew more desperate, more vicious in her attempts to deflect responsibility and maintain some shred of control over the situation. "You're all being ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people wince. "I've spent years holding this family together, maintaining our standards, keeping everyone connected, and this is the thanks I get? A lynch mob turning against me because I tried to preserve some recipes and made an honest mistake." Helena, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, spoke up gently. "Mrs. Patterson, with respect, taking someone's family recipes without permission isn't preserving them. It's theft. And what you did to that particular recipe shows a fundamental misunderstanding of cooking techniques that Auguste spent years perfecting." Dorothy's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "I don't need a lecture from some stranger about cooking. I've been preparing meals for this family longer than you've been alive." "Actually," Helena replied calmly, "I'm 43 years old, and I've been cooking professionally for 25 years. I trained under Auguste Beaumont himself for 3 years before he died. I know his recipes intimately, and I can tell you exactly what went wrong with your attempt." The challenge in Helena's voice was unmistakable, and Dorothy rose to meet it like a bull charging a red flag. "Fine then, chef," she said, spitting the title like a curse. "Tell me what I did wrong." Helena moved to the casserole dish and lifted the lid again, examining the contents with professional expertise. "First, you used the wrong type of wine. Augustus' original recipe specifically calls for a Louisiana muscadine wine, which has a particular sweetness and acidity. You used what looks like a generic cooking wine from the grocery store." Dorothy's mouth opened to protest, but Helena continued. "Second, you completely omitted the andouille sausage, which provides the smokiness that balances the wine's sweetness. Third, you used regular paprika instead of smoked paprika, and you used far too much of it. Fourth, the vegetables are overcooked because you didn't follow Auguste's specific timing for adding each ingredient." With each criticism, Dorothy's face grew redder, and I could see her losing control of her temper. How could I know all those details? The recipe didn't specify all of that. "Actually, it did," I said quietly. "My grandmother's handwriting is very detailed. She wrote down every variation Auguste taught her, every timing note, every substitution he tried that didn't work." Helena nodded. Rose was famous for her meticulous notes. Auguste used to say she was a better record keeper than he was. Dorothy whirled around to face me, her composure completely shattered now. "Well, maybe if you'd shared these precious family secrets instead of hoarding them selfishly, I wouldn't have had to guess at the details. Maybe if you'd tried to be part of this family instead of acting like you were too good for our traditions, none of this would have happened." The attack was so sudden and vicious that it took me a moment to respond, but Marcus was faster. "That's enough," he said, stepping between his mother and me. "You don't get to blame Jillian for your behavior. You stole her property, violated her privacy, and then insulted her family's legacy. Nothing she did or didn't do justifies that." But Dorothy wasn't finished. Desperation had made her reckless, and in her fury, she made a critical error. "I was just trying to help her improve her cooking," she snarled. "Someone had to, considering how many disasters she's brought to our family gatherings over the years." "What disasters?" Beth asked. "Gillian's food has always been delicious when she's brought it here." Dorothy laughed bitterly. "Delicious? That dry chicken she made for Easter? Those flat cookies at Christmas? The soup that was so bland it tasted like dishwater?" Something cold settled in my stomach as Dorothy continued her tirade, because she was describing specific failures, specific dishes that had indeed gone wrong when Id brought them to family gatherings. But as I listened to her detailed critiques, a horrible realization began to dawn. "How do you know the chicken was dry?" Marcus asked slowly. "You barely tasted it before declaring it needed more seasoning." Dorothy froze, and I could see the exact moment she realized her mistake. She had revealed knowledge she shouldn't have possessed, details she couldn't know unless she had been more involved in those cooking failures than anyone realized. I could tell just by looking at it, she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Frank was studying his wife with growing alarm. Dorothy, what exactly are you saying? How do you know so much about what went wrong with Gillian's dishes? The silence that followed was deafening. I was thinking furiously now, remembering all the times I had brought food to family gatherings that had somehow gone wrong despite my careful preparation at home. Dishes that had turned out perfectly in my own kitchen but had somehow failed spectacularly when served at Dorothy's table. You know what? I said quietly, and my voice carried across the room like a whisper in a cathedral. I never could understand why my cooking always seemed to go wrong at family gatherings. The same recipes that worked perfectly at home would somehow fail when I brought them here. Dorothy's face had gone pale, and she was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Marcus was staring at his mother with dawning horror. Mom, what did you do? And then Dorothy, cornered and desperate and too angry to think clearly, made the confession that would end any chance of redemption she might have had. I was trying to help her learn, she said defensively. She was so proud of her cooking, so confident, but she wasn't ready to feed this family properly. So I made some adjustments to help her understand that she needed more practice before she could contribute to our traditions. The words hung in the air like acid smoke. Frank's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. What kind of adjustments? Helena asked, her voice deadly quiet. Dorothy looked around the room desperately, but found no allies, no escape from the trap her own anger had created. I replaced some of her ingredients with less expensive versions. The vanilla extract was too strong, so I diluted it. The flour she used was unnecessarily premium, so I substituted regular flour. Her olive oil was too peppery, so I mixed it with vegetable oil to tone it down. Each confession hit the room like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak as the full scope of Dorothy's sabotage became clear. For 2 years, she had been systematically undermining my cooking, setting me up to fail, and then positioning herself as the helpful mother-in-law who could step in to save the day. Marcus was looking at his mother like he'd never seen her before. You sabotaged her food? You deliberately ruined her cooking to make her look incompetent. I was protecting this family, Dorothy said, but even she seemed to realize how weak that justification sounded. She was trying to change our traditions, bring in outside influences, disrupt the way we've always done things. Frank stood up slowly, his face ashen. 40 years of marriage, he said quietly. 40 years, and I never knew you were capable of this kind of cruelty. The room erupted in angry voices as family members began to understand the full scope of Dorothy's manipulation. But all I could do was stand there in shock, finally understanding why I had spent 2 years feeling like a failure in the kitchen, why every attempt to contribute to family gatherings had ended in humiliation. Dorothy had been waging a secret war against me, and I had never even known we were fighting. The silence that followed Frank's words was different from all the others that had punctuated this extraordinary evening. This wasn't the silence of shock or surprise or even anger. This was the profound quiet that comes when a family collectively realizes that someone they love has been living a lie for years, manipulating and controlling and hurting the people around her while presenting herself as the victim. I found my voice first, and when I spoke, it was with a calmness that surprised even me. The storm of emotions that had been churning inside me for 2 years had suddenly stilled, replaced by a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dorothy, I said, standing up and facing her directly, I need you to understand something. I'm done. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand to stop her. I'm done being your target. I'm done walking on eggshells around you. I'm done pretending that your behavior is acceptable because you're Marcus' mother. I'm done allowing you to sabotage my happiness and my marriage because you can't handle the fact that your son chose me. Marcus stepped up beside me, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Mom, I love you, but what you've done to Jillian, what you've done to this family, is unforgivable. You've spent 2 years systematically destroying my wife's confidence, manipulating me, interfering in other people's lives, and lying to all of us about who you really are. Dorothy looked around the room desperately, searching for someone who might defend her, but found only disappointed faces and shaking heads. Frank was sitting in his chair like a man who had aged 10 years in one evening, staring at his hands and occasionally glancing at his wife like she was a stranger who had wandered into his home. "I want you to get help," Marcus continued. "Professional help. Because this isn't normal behavior, Mom. Normal people don't sabotage their children's marriages. Normal people don't steal family heirlooms. Normal people don't spend years manipulating and controlling everyone around them." Helena, who had been quietly observing our family drama, stepped forward with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to handling high-stress situations in professional kitchens. "If I may," she said softly, "I'd like to extend an invitation to Jillian." All eyes turned to her, and she smiled at me with warmth that felt like a balm on my bruised spirit. Auguste left very specific instructions about his legacy. He wanted his early recipes to be preserved and shared, not hidden away in museums or private collections. He envisioned a small, intimate restaurant that would honor the techniques and philosophy he developed with Rose in those early years. My heart started beating faster as I realized what she was suggesting. "I've been looking for the right partner for this project for 5 years," Helena continued. "Someone who understands not just the recipes but the spirit behind them, the love and creativity and collaboration that went into creating them. I think your grandmother would be proud to know that her legacy is finally going to be shared with the world." Marcus squeezed my hand, and I could see tears in his eyes as he realized that his family's evening of reckoning was turning into something beautiful for his wife. "Jillian, this is what you've always dreamed of. Your own restaurant, your grandmother's recipes, a chance to honor her memory." I looked around the room at the faces surrounding me. Beth was beaming with excitement. David was nodding encouragingly. Stephen was already pulling out his phone to offer marketing support for the future restaurant. Carol was wiping away tears and talking about designing the perfect garden space for outdoor dining. Even Frank, devastated by his wife's revelations, managed a small smile. "Rose would be so proud," he said quietly. "And Auguste, too. To know that their collaboration is finally going to be celebrated the way it deserved." But it was Dorothy's reaction that surprised me most. The fight had gone out of her completely, and she was crying quietly, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. When she looked at me, I saw something I had never seen before in her eyes. Genuine remorse. "Jillian," she said, her voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry. I was so afraid of losing my place in this family, so threatened by how much Marcus loved you, that I convinced myself I was protecting everyone from making a mistake. But the only mistake was mine." Frank looked at his wife with a mixture of sadness and disappointment that was heartbreaking to witness. "Dorothy, you need help. Real help, and you need to stay away from family gatherings until you can prove that you've changed." The birthday party that had begun with Dorothy's cruel insult ended 3 hours later with hugs and tears and promises to stay in touch. Helena and I exchanged contact information and made plans to meet the following week to discuss the restaurant project. Marcus and I drove home in comfortable silence, both of us processing the dramatic changes that had transformed our lives in the span of a single evening. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of Rose and Auguste, the small restaurant Helena and I had opened in a charming converted Victorian house on the north side of Chicago. The reviews had been incredible, with food critics praising our soulful fusion of French technique and Louisiana flavor and our intimate atmosphere that makes every diner feel like family. Marcus was there for our opening night, of course, along with Beth and David and Stephen and the rest of the family who had supported us through the challenging months of renovation and menu development. Frank came too, looking older but more peaceful than I'd seen him in years. Dorothy was not there. She had spent 6 months in intensive therapy, working to understand the roots of her controlling behavior and learning healthier ways to manage her fears about change and loss of control. She had written me several letters of apology, but I wasn't ready to see her yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. The most meaningful moment of the evening came when Helena presented me with a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Auguste Beaumont. Inside, in his careful handwriting, were pages and pages of notes about my grandmother, stories about their collaboration, and expressions of regret that he had lost touch with her. "Your grandmother changed his life," Helena told me as we looked through the journal together. He credited her with teaching him that the best food comes from love and community, not just technique and ambition. As I read Augustus' words about my grandmother Rose, I realized that Dorothy's betrayal, as painful as it had led me to something I never would have discovered otherwise. My family's legacy wasn't just a collection of recipes in an old cookbook. It was a living tradition of creativity and collaboration and love that deserved to be shared with the world. The evening ended with a toast to my grandmother and Auguste, to second chances and new beginnings, to the power of truth over manipulation, and to the family we choose as much as the family we're born into. Standing in my own restaurant, surrounded by people who truly supported and loved me, I finally understood what my grandmother had known all along. The best revenge is living well, cooking with love, and never letting anyone convince you that you're not worthy of your dreams. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the worst betrayals, and sometimes the people who try to tear you down end up showing you exactly how strong you really are. I hope this story reminds you to value the people who celebrate your success instead of sabotaging it, to protect what's precious to you from those who would diminish it, and to never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big or your heritage too small to matter. What family traditions do you treasure most, and how do you honor the people who came before you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if it touched your heart. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself and following your dreams, and share this with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't define their future but can inspire it. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you have the power to write your own ending, no matter who tries to edit your chapters along the way.